Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. Please be aware, each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. You may submit your questions electronically anytime using the chat pod located to the right of your webinar platform. You may also download a copy of today's presentation using the Files pod located directly below the presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Chris Hunt. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy holidays. Some good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to the December AHA Team Training Monthly Webinar. And this one is on community conversations. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chris Hunt. I'm Senior Director with the Center for Health Innovation at the American Hospital Association, and I direct our AHA Team Training Program. So just some rules of engagement as we get going here today. First is about audio. So if you can listen to this through your computer, that is fine. That's a good thing to do. But if you don't have a great internet connection, we find that it's always better to listen through your phone. If you do listen through your phone, you're going to want to mute your computer speakers. And that is an important thing to do because otherwise you are going to end up having some crazy feedback, kind of like the radio. So just go up. If you look at the top, there's a speaker button. You could use that to mute it if you're listening through your phone. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So the way that we like to do questions and answers throughout this is for you to chat them in. You'll see the chat box on your screen. That's where everybody right now is saying hello and where they're from. So feel free to use that chat box as we go if you have any questions that you want answered. Then what's going to happen is I will gather those questions and we will do a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I try to do a good mixture of different types of questions that happen throughout the presentation. So that's the way that we like to go about and do questions. Just a few announcements as we get started here at the end of the year. Courses for 2020, Team Steps Master Training courses, Team Steps Fundamentals courses, and specialty courses are now all open. You can view our course schedule at the hyperlink that's on this page. Here's a special deal. If you sign up by December 31st, you can use the code TT2019 to get $50 off. So that is a special deal that we're running right now here at the end of the year for 2020 courses. So if you're interested, get some little discounts, you can come on in and do that. It's kind of like a holiday deal. Also, we have webinars all the way into next year as we continue. So January 8th is our first webinar of 2020. This webinar is called Shrinking the Change and Leveraging Bright Spots in Your Team Steps Implementation. So that will be a Team Steps specific webinar, and that will be January 8th. Also, the 2020 AHA Team Training National Conference registration is now open. So head on over here to register to learn more about the conference. It's going to be June 3rd through 5th, 2020 in New Orleans. Right now we have early bird and special registration rates available for teams. So please go on over and register for that. And as I'm sitting in a wind chill of 10 degrees in Chicago, New Orleans sounds really great right now. So looking forward to that. And I'll tell you, we've been going through all of the proposals from the community for people to present at the conference, and it looks great. There's going to be a wide variety of topics and a wide spectrum of speakers from all over the healthcare world. So come and join us down in New Orleans in June. If you have any questions, please always shoot us an email or visit our website or give us a call. We try to get back to you as soon as possible, normally within a day. So if you have any questions at all, please use those manners of getting in touch with us. Okay, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Kurt O'Brien, who is the Senior Lecturer in the MHA program in the Department of Health Services at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I've known Kurt for a long time. I think I met Kurt maybe back in 2010, so we're getting on almost a full decade of working together. And Kurt has been involved in a variety of fields in organizational development as well as in healthcare. So I feel like he is a different speaker we're bringing in today to help us tackle a difficult topic of communication. So Kurt, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Chris. Appreciate the nice intro. And yeah, it has been quite a while we've been working together, and it's been fantastic. So I'd like to give you all a little bit more background about me and who I am before we dive into the content here. And this is fascinating. I'm watching the chat and everybody's logging in and saying hello. And man, not just from all over the country, but I see Japan and England, quite a few people from here in Seattle, which is where I'm calling from today. So thank you all for joining. So as Chris mentioned, I've worked in the field of organization development for probably 25-ish years now, and I was with UW-Medicine Health System for 15 years, and for several of those years I was the Director of Organization Development and Training, and did quite a bit of work with Ross Ermintrout, who I know many of you know, around implementing team steps and other facets of team training in the UW-Medicine Health System. I do a lot of work around leadership development, strategy development. About 4 years ago, I shifted down to permanent faculty in the Master in Healthcare Administration program at the university and left UW-Medicine, and I have an independent consulting practice as well. Primarily, I work with healthcare organizations. And just if you're interested, before I joined healthcare, like I said, it's been 19 years ago I joined the university. I was in the Coast Guard. I spent 12 years active duty in the Coast Guard. So let's talk a little bit about today. You've read the description, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we're going to spend some time talking today about this concept of community conversations. And it's a topic that I've become quite interested in over the last, I'd say 3 years or so. And when Chris and Abby and Jen approached me about potentially hosting a webinar, we talked about various topics and thought this would be a fun one to bring to the Team Steps community. So let's dive in here to the learning objectives. We could spend, I think, hours on this, but really what I want to get out of today is that you get a chance to learn about the 6 community conversations that Peter Block brings to the world. And we're going to talk also about what's the difference between questions that have great power and questions that have little power. And then at the end, you'll have the opportunity to identify 1 or 2 specific community-based conversations that you might be able to bring in to your own organization or to use with a specific team that you are affiliated with. So that's where we're going. So I want to open this up right out of the gate with a polling question. And this is open-ended, so you will respond in your chat box. What I'm curious about is how would you respond to this prompt? What would it mean to my team, and you can define team broadly as whatever it means for you, if everyone on that team had a stronger sense of ownership? What would that mean to you? So I'm just going to wait and see what we get coming in. Okay, I see trust, efficiency, and better ideas, better outcomes. Okay, trust, kind of more respect, productivity, the efficiency and outcomes, greater community and productivity. Accountability is coming in now, improved communication, shorter wait times, okay. More initiative, okay. Urgency and action, improved collaboration. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to move forward. I have one more polling question with an open-ended chat conversation. So here's the second question. What would it mean to you, to your team, if everyone was committed to creating a new vision of your future? So let's shift the context from ownership to commitment to creating a new vision together. Direction and engagement. We would build a great workplace. Hear, hear. Synergy. Forward-thinking behavior. Commitment to change. Okay, more shared accountability. Kristen, hi, Kristen from Swedish. We provide a sense of urgency and collaboration. Okay, better collaboration. Synergy squared, love it. Innovation, interesting. Culture of safety. Okay, communication with a bunch of exclamation points. Engagement is certainly a theme. Okay, great, excellent thoughts. I wanted to pose these two questions just to sort of see where were you all coming from with these types of questions, these kinds of thoughts, and how does it relate back to our content today around building community conversations. And so these are, so we're out of polling now. Thank you everybody for participating. It was really helpful, like seeing your responses there. So this whole notion of what makes a community, these are just some open-ended questions, not to respond to necessarily in chat, but just to get us thinking a little bit about what do we even mean by the word community and building a community and bringing people together in community. And so as we go through this presentation, I'd like you to kind of keep these in mind, especially this idea of thinking about your own experiences. What would you say are the hallmarks of strong community? From your own perspective, your own experiences, and not just from an organizational perspective. This is community writ large. If you could foster a greater sense of community in your organization, department, and team, would it be a worthy goal, worthwhile work? And again, I think it comes back to we need to be clear about what do we even mean by community. So we'll spend some time talking about that today. And what can you do to explicitly do more to build community? So these are topics we're going to cover. A few other thoughts before I get to talking about Peter Block is I guess I want to clarify, this is, I'm not going to be presenting data. I'm not going to be presenting graphs. This is not about helping us manage conflict in our lives. There are other tools and frameworks that I think help us do that. This really is about how do we bring people together in new ways and change the nature of the conversation that we're having. And I've come to believe that this is perhaps a missing piece in our organizations as we try to do, especially in healthcare, as we try to do the work of moving healthcare forward and improving healthcare. And so, for example, if you consider the burnout epidemic that is a hot topic right now in healthcare, and the ways in which we're approaching that topic, I'm wondering if we're still applying a bit too much what I would call technical thinking or reductionist thinking to that process. And what would it mean if we brought people together and changed the nature of the conversation around burnout and really got into the, the deeper issue and the values that are present and how are people being affected by burnout and senses of isolation and how do we connect it back to community. So, so that would be an example of where we're going with this work. So Peter Block, or who is this guy and why should we care? So Peter Block is a long-time organization development consultant. I'm guessing some of you may be familiar with him. Back in the 80s, he wrote a book called Flawless Consulting, which for me at that time was, we actually had his book as a textbook when I was in college taking organization development classes at the Coast Guard Academy. And by the way, I just gave you a little sense of how old I am too. And so Block is well known in that field. A number of years ago, he stopped consulting with organizations and decided he wanted to commit himself to helping communities advance their work. And so he wrote a book called Community, The Structure of Belonging. And I was introduced to this book probably about 4 years ago. And it was in the context of doing some consulting work down at a health system in Oregon. And a colleague and I put together a leadership program that was based on adaptive leadership principles. And when folks came to us, and this was the COO and the chief medical officer of this particular organization, they wanted to, as a framework, use relationship-centered care. And for those of you who are familiar with relationship-centered care, it has 4 components to it. The 4 components are relationship with self, relationship with patients, relationship with colleagues or peers, and the last one is relationship with community. And so as we were doing the design work, we knew we had to address this issue of relationship with community, and that's what drove us to Peter Block's work. So Block has a particular perspective about this community-based work, and if you actually go in and read his book, which I would highly recommend, it's split into 2 components. The first part of the book is really about the theories and other frameworks that informed his thinking around building community. The second part of the work is application focused. So most people, when they get the book, they tend to go right to the second part, because we all are about application, which is fine. I would also, if this is work that interests you and you choose to get his book, if you do that, do go back and look at the front part of the book, because there's a lot of important information in there. All right, so let's move forward. So here's what Peter Block says right out of the gate. He says, community-based work has implications for the leaders, and 3 particular tasks that he calls out. And so let's talk about these a little bit. The first one is, as you can read here, create a context that nurtures an alternative future that is based on gifts, generosity, accountability, and commitment. There is a lot going on in that statement. First of all, what do we even mean by an alternative future? And what is this notion of gifts, generosity, accountability, and commitment from a community-based perspective? So we're going to cover some of this in more detail, but this idea of alternative future, what Block believes is that we have spent too much time focusing on problems and not enough time focusing on possibility. And so his notion is that when we bring people together to do community-based work, it should be addressing the possibilities that the community can see together, and how do they co-create those possibilities, or in other words, this alternative future. So that's what he's talking about. And this notion of gifts, generosity, accountability, and commitment we'll get into a little bit more when we start looking at some of the specific community-based conversations. The second bullet, initiate and convene conversations that shift people's experience. Right? So then he says we do this in how we bring people together and the nature of the questions that we ask. Block is fond of saying, and I love this saying, that sometimes the only thing he has any control over when he brings a group of people together is how to set up the room. Where do you move the furniture? How do you set up the chairs? Right? And that has a huge effect on how people will engage and interact and have conversations with each other. So this whole notion of how we bring people together, he's being quite literal about that, right down to how do we move the furniture. And when we do that, that's what shifts people's experience. And then this last one, it sounds so simple, listen and pay attention. But what's really going on there? What does that truly entail, to listen and pay attention, right? And so for those of you who are familiar with adaptive leadership and Ron Heifetz's work around adaptive leadership, the notion of going to the balcony and looking down on the situation from a different perspective, call that balcony work. And the ability to do that helps us listen and pay attention and see things from new perspectives. So even though that sounds like a fairly simple bulleted statement, it's sometimes easier said than done. All right, so for those of you who have specific leadership roles, I'd encourage you to consider those 3 tasks. And for those of you who don't have a specific leadership role, I would say you're exercising leadership each and every day, so these are just as equally important. So then Block goes on and he talks about the specific purpose of community work. And again, you're going to see this piece, create an alternative future. Then he moves on to focusing on ways to shift the context or reframe. And as I mentioned earlier, he is a proponent of saying we need to shift from talking about specific problems and move to talking about possibilities, and that's the reframing of context that he's talking about. Build relatedness, that's really what it's all about, and how do we create space for more intentional possibility? So the question becomes, how in the world do we do this? For community-based work, what we're really talking about is convening small groups. And so even if you have a large group of people, break them into small groups, and they have specific work that they have to do in those small groups. And now, as you see here in these pictures, paying attention to how we set up the room, set up the furniture becomes important. And when I've done this work, I have been very intentional about not having tables in between people, setting up the chairs in small clusters of either 3 or 4. In fact, I would say that in these photos that may even be too many. And then you give people a question, and then they start talking about it, and you give them a time limit to have that conversation, and then you have an opportunity to bring that back into a larger group. All right, so I want to move to talking about questions. So here's a polling question with several responses. I'm maybe curious to see how you all respond to this particular question. I believe I routinely ask powerful questions of others that cause them to think deeply and have meaningful conversation with colleagues. All right, we have a lot of votes for sometimes, a few less than that for often, and not many at all for rarely and always. All right, cool. All right, so let's talk about this notion for a moment of the distinction between powerful questions, ones that have great power and ones that have little power, and think about the responses that you just made. So questions with little power. These are some examples, right? So when we ask questions that are framed this way, now this is from Peter Block's perspective, okay? So for example, how do we get others to buy into our vision? What new policy will move our interests forward? How do we get people to show up and be committed? How do we get others to be more responsible? I'm guessing that these are questions that you have found yourselves asking from time to time. And here's why Peter Block says these questions don't have as much power as we might believe they do, even though we think, hey, I'm asking an open-ended question. That's a good thing, right? That's what I was taught to do. In fact, I can tell you, I have asked all of these questions multiple times. And so when I read his work, it really shifted my thinking on this. And so the reason he says these questions actually don't have that much power is because these are questions we routinely ask, and it's doing more of what we already do. It's asking the same type of questions that we've already been asking. It really doesn't change anything. The other thing he points out is that the nature of these questions can actually contain a hidden agenda. In other words, I know more than you do, or I have the answer, and I'm just going to ask you and see if what you say, if you agree with that or not. Just take this question, how do we get others to buy into our vision? It says, oh, we already have a vision. I know what that vision is. It's other people's job to buy into that. So that's kind of what he's talking about. The other thing that he says that's a risk with these particular questions is that it can imply that others are the problem, not me. I've got it figured out. I know what's going on. If these other people would get it together, then we could move things forward. The last thing I'd point out about these questions on the left-hand side is that they can actually increase fragmentation. Right? So if we're talking about how do we get these people to change, it could imply or could be perceived that, you know, I or my team or my leadership team, you know, we're all about change and we know how to do that. It's these other people. And so, again, that's the risk in terms of creating fragmentation. So now let's compare that to the questions on the right, right? Questions with great power. Again, according to Peter Block. How valuable do you plan for this effort to be? Or consider, what is the story you keep telling yourself about the problems of this community? And what is your contribution to the very thing you complain about? So this is interesting, right? They're a little bit different. And so he points out that questions with great power have three qualities. And those qualities are, first, they're a bit ambiguous. You don't want to lead people, you're asking the question because you want to engage them in a new way. You want to shift the context. You want to get people to start to reframe things. So ambiguity is not a bad thing. And I found that when I try to ask these types of questions and people push back and say, can you be more specific? I just say, no, that's the question. And people, they work with it. They come up with things. It's pretty cool. The other thing is that another quality is that they're personal, right? It taps into people's passions and commitments, what they really care about. So that's another quality. And the third quality is that they invoke a bit of anxiety. You know, when we raise the heat, if you will, a little bit, or put a little bit more of an edge to the question, it engages us in a different way. It actually, Peter Block will say, it actually forces us to become a little bit more alive in the conversation. And so I didn't put those three qualities in the slides, but just as there is a handout that's available to you, a PDF file that I put together a few years ago that's available to you, and it lists those qualities out. So now, so we talked a little bit about the distinction between questions with little power and questions with great power. I want to go back to the polling question. Let's revisit this. So now that we've talked about this, I'm curious, how would you answer this same question now, based on what we've talked about? And we are seeing a shift. I was just curious. I wasn't sure how this was going to, this is an experiment. But we're certainly seeing a lot more in rarely. Rarely was quite small. It was like, 1 or 2% the first go around, and now we're up near 40%. And sometimes it's dropped down, and often has also dropped down. So, so that is and that doesn't surprise me because I had the exact same experience upon reading Block's work and learning about the distinction between these questions. All right. So now what you've really all been probably waiting for is what the heck are these conversations, these questions that we should be asking people. So that's what I want to dive into next. So Block hypothesizes, offers up, if you will, 6 community-based conversations that we ought to be considering having. Now, he's largely talking about from the standpoint of actual community-based work, but I think these work equally well in our organizations. Furthermore, with all of the focus in healthcare these days on population health and getting out and interacting with our communities in more explicit ways, I think these conversations could open up the door for us to do some more of that work and in some new ways. So, maybe when we have the Q&A, all of you will have some additional thoughts about that. So the 6 conversations are the invitation, the possibility conversation, ownership, dissent, commitment, and gifts. We're going to cover each one of these except invitation, because what I want to say about the invitation is simply be mindful about how you invite people to participate in a given conversation or a given piece of work. And so, he has some guidelines and some thoughts around that. But I think this notion of considering it as an invitation, just using that word, shifts the context a little bit, right? If we are inviting people to participate is different than saying, hey, I need you to come to this. So something to consider. All right, so let's move along and talk about the first conversation, the possibility conversation. So these are examples of questions that Block poses. So what are the crossroads where we find ourselves? I've actually asked this question of groups, and it's interesting to see how they process that. And people dive in and they start to, I think, talk in more explicit ways about what are the actual challenges that they're dealing with. Second question, what declaration of possibility can we make that has the power to transform our team and inspire us? So just think about that question for a minute. What declaration of possibility, just take that piece, declaration of possibility, can we make that has the power to transform our team and inspire us? So there's a lot going on with that particular prompt. And, you know, Block is a big believer, and I share that thought, that language is important. The words we choose to use are important. And earlier on in the presentation, when we talked about the role of a leader being listen and pay attention, I would put paying attention to language and words is part of that deal. And then last, what can we create together that we cannot create alone? So again, the invitation here is, how do we co-create something that we could not otherwise do by ourselves, right? And so as we go through these conversations, I'm going to encourage you to start thinking about which of these do you think you could actually ask of your own team, people that you work with, or maybe even out in your community, if some of you are doing that work right now. So some things to consider and think about. All right, so this is the possibility conversation. And again, this is what Block is focused on. How do we shift things from focusing on problems to focusing on possibilities? Where can we, that alternative future that we can co-create? So these would be questions that you could use in that regard. All right, so now let's shift the ownership conversation. Think about all of the times we chat with each other about, oh, if we could just get people to contribute more, to really own the problem or own the situation. And so these are some other questions to potentially ask if ownership is what you're after. And by the way, ownership is different from buy-in. And if you are interested in that distinction, I would encourage you to go to Liberating Structures, liberatingstructures.com. For those of you who may be familiar with it, some may not. And there is a body of work in there that talks about the distinction between buy-in and ownership, and they are two different things. So if what we're after is ownership, here are some questions we can ask. To what extent are we invested in the well-being of the whole? How much risk are we actually willing to take? Or how valuable an experience do you plan for this to be? That third question is one that I've asked groups sometimes at the very beginning of a body of work that I'm doing with them. And it's just to sometimes we come in, it's like, I'm just here and I'm going to listen, see what comes up. But this hooks you right from the get-go, right? How valuable an experience do you plan for this to be? We can also go deeper with the ownership conversation. And it's interesting when I talk with groups about, leadership teams in particular, about using these community-based conversations, for some reason these three always pop up. What have I done to contribute to the very thing I complain about or want to change, right? We don't often think about that. We don't necessarily see ourselves in that body of work. What is the story about this team that you hear yourself most often telling, the one that you are wedded to and maybe even take your identity from? That, that raises the heat a little bit. That evokes a little bit of anxiety, as Block would say, in terms of those three qualities of powerful questions. And then finally, what is your attachment to the story costing you? So, sometimes people say, I want to start with those three questions. Peter Block would urge caution. He would say, start with those first three first, initially, and then go deeper and explore some of these additional questions. All right. Now, what I found interesting is Block also finds space to allow for us to talk about what's not working for us, to actually dissent. And if you think about our organizations, I don't know that we do that very often. And so consider these questions to ask people. What doubt and reservations do you have about this situation or this issue or where we're trying to go? Or, I love this second one, what have you said yes to that you no longer really mean? Right? What have you said yes to that you no longer really mean? And so again, some interesting things that come out from people having dialogue and conversation about those particular questions. And if we just sit and pay attention and listen, we'll learn an awful lot. Next conversation, the commitment conversation. So you can read these here, promises I'm willing to make. Third question was the impact on others for me to keep my commitments or fail at my commitments. So now it's getting me outside of my own skin, considering others. It's that middle question that I particularly like. What is the promise I'm willing to make that constitutes a risk or major shift for me? I've actually started asking this question when I'm taking cohort groups through leadership training. So I do quite a bit of work with physician leadership development. And I've started asking this question, and typically I like to work with them for a minimum of 6 months, if not longer, meeting on a regular basis. And to ask this question, so here you are, you're in this leadership development program. What is the promise you're willing to make to your own development, in this case, that constitutes a risk or major shift? And I've had people come up afterwards and say they really appreciated that question being posed because they had not thought of that. Again, we can just sort of get, I'm here to learn, fill me up with the knowledge. Oh, wait, this means that I've got to take some ownership for my own learning and development. So that'd be an example of how to use that particular question. And finally, we have the gifts conversation. So here, Block is not talking at all about presents, like I'm going to give you this gift. He's talking about the gifts that each of us intrinsically have inside ourselves, right? And if you think back at the very beginning of this presentation, when he talks about the 3 specific tasks for a leader, he says the 3 tasks are to create a context, to nurture an alternative future that is based on gifts, generosity, accountability, and commitment. So here you have the gifts conversation. So what gifts have you received from others in this room? What has someone in your small group done today that has moved you or been of value to you? And in what way did a particular person engage you in a way that had meaning? Find them and talk to them. And so he has some other prompts around the gift conversation that I think evoke even a bit more anxiety, but these were the ones that I thought might be useful to share today. I have started bringing these conversations in when I'm doing my teaching in the executive MHA program. And when a session is wrapping up, say we've been together for an entire day, I will often, for example, share that second and third prompt. What has someone in your small group done today that's moved you or been of value? Or how did somebody engage you? Find them, actually talk to them, say what it was that moved you. And people are a little hesitant sometimes at first, but once they get into it, the volume in the room just goes through the roof, and people are smiling and laughing, and I see people hugging sometimes. So again, something else to consider in terms of bringing this notion of the gifts that we have into the room. All right. So looking at a few notes here, stand by. I want to share 2 examples. One example is how I used these questions in a program down in Oregon. And then I'd like to share an example of how I believe, I don't know for sure, but how I believe a particular organization has actually moved and shifted to more of what I would call a community-based organization. And then I'll ask one more polling question and we'll wrap it up. So when I went down to Oregon, as I was talking about earlier, to design that leadership program that was based on 2 things, relationship-centered care and also an adaptive leadership framework, my co-designer and I had a full day basically to figure out how are we going to bring this. It was a 4-month program. And this is a group of primarily physician leaders, but also a few administrative leaders that were coming together to attend this particular program. So we met for we met for 4 months, 2 days each month. And so the last weekend was to examine this whole notion of community. And so we started right out of the gate with posing these community conversations, talking about Peter Block's notion of what does it mean to create community. And then what we did was we basically said, hey, you know, what are some issues that you're dealing with that you think you could apply, you could see yourselves applying these specific community conversations. And we put them into small groups and let them have at it. And they had over an hour to do that work. And then they had to present out. It was fascinating. They were thinking about the issues that they were that they had initially presented in entirely new ways. And they were thinking in entirely new ways about how they wanted to go and engage people around those topics or issues. And afterwards, we had a lot of people come up and mention to us that it really did help shift their thinking about how to approach the particular challenge or problem that they were talking about, and shifted their thinking about how to engage and bring people together to do meaningful work. And I guess that idea for me, that idea of meaningful work, how do we do meaningful work together? You know, I'm well-versed in team steps. I'm well-versed in other team models like Amy Edmondson's teaming, and those are all great, and they've got a lot of good content and good skills. But this notion of how do we bring people together to do more meaningful work, I think we might miss the boat on that sometimes, and I believe that these community-based conversations can help us more. Again, my bias, I own that, but that's my thought. All right, so I'd like to provide an organizational example. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Buurtzorg. This is a healthcare organization in the Netherlands that was established about 13 years ago, and the impetus behind establishing it was the guy who is now the quote-unquote CEO, although he doesn't really use that title much. He and 3 other nurses were just tired and fed up with how patient care was happening and the limitations in the healthcare organizations that they worked in. So they decided that they were going to create their own organization, if you will, and they were going to go back out into the neighborhoods and provide care to the community. 10 years later, they had hundreds of teams spread, and what they ended up doing was establishing teams of 12 nurses. And these teams are all self-managed. They're nurse-led and self-managed teams. It's highly decentralized. The only centralized support they get is facilitators that can come in and sometimes help the team if they get really stuck. Otherwise, they're on their own. If you decide that you want to start up a new organization in a new neighborhood, a new team, if you will, then that team comes together, no more than 12 people, and they identify the neighborhood, they identify their office space, where they're going to work out of, they establish the connections and relationships with other healthcare professionals in that area. And at the end of the day, they claim they have the highest patient satisfaction rates anywhere. The other piece of data they have is that for the last 5 years, last 4 years, they have won the distinction of being the best place to work in all of Holland. So it's just interesting. I think that you use an example like this, and for me, what they're doing is they're actually being very thoughtful about how to engage community in a new way. Whether or not they used any of Peter Block's questions, I have no idea. But I just thought this was an interesting example of how a group of people came together and said, we can do more, we can engage with our community in new ways. I think they created an alternative future that for them was, at the end of the day, more meaningful, and was certainly more meaningful than their patients. All right, so last question. We spent some time here talking about Peter Block, his ideas about community, and we've covered 5 in-depth community conversations. I'm curious, what would you walk out of here and actually try? So polling is open. Well, it looks like the possibility conversation is getting a lot of votes, some for the ownership, a few for the dissent, a few for gifts. Cool. All right, so, we might let this run for another few seconds here. I guess what I would do is encourage you to try something, to try asking one of these prompts, one of these questions, even in a meeting that you have, down the road, and just see how people react. Do they respond differently? Conduct your own experiment around it, I guess, is what I would encourage. The last thing I'd like to do is, before we open this up to questions, is just read a quote from Peter Block's book, just as some final thoughts to leave you with around community. So he's going on to say, community, as used here, is about the experience of belonging. We are in community each time we find a place where we belong. The word belong has two meanings. First and foremost, to belong is to be related to and a part of something. It is membership, the experience of being at home in the broadest sense of the phrase. It is the opposite of thinking that wherever I am, I would be better off somewhere else, or that I am still forever wandering, looking for that place where I belong. The opposite of belonging is to feel isolated and always on the margin, an outsider. To belong is to know, even in the middle of the night, that I am among friends. And for me, that does a nice job of summarizing this idea of community conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to help us facilitate a Q&A.
Oh, thanks, Kurt. That was a really great presentation, and that last quote really, I think, is really meaningful and moving. That's really good. I've got some questions here. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is around having these conversations. So, and getting to the point where you can have these conversations and actually doing it. So, I see a lot of opportunity here to be empathetic and to, when asking these questions, even from the perspective of the person asking, really be able to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's, who you're asking. Is that a part of this, that kind of, building that culture of empathy?
Absolutely. I think empathy is absolutely a part of this, Chris. And for me, when I think about empathy, I fall back on Marshall Rosenberg's work from Nonviolent Communication, where he essentially is saying, look, empathy is about understanding and acknowledging that we all have emotions and we can get, triggered by various things, and that trigger is related back to unmet needs. And for me, that's the power of Rosenberg's work, is this notion of understanding what are the unmet needs that each of us has, and how do we respond when those needs we have aren't met. And they're oftentimes connected back to deeply held values. And so I think one of the things Block's work does, these community-based conversations, is they bring us back to what do we care deeply about, and even from a values perspective. So yes, absolutely. I think there's an empathy connection there.
That's you brought up that point about understanding those unmet needs, and no matter what you're designing for, like that's really the first design criteria, right? Is how do you meet those unmet needs? So that's a very interesting connection. So how do you go about having these conversations with people who don't want to have them? And this could be because maybe they're in a different part of the power gradient than you are. Maybe you're wanting to have this conversation with somebody higher than you, quote unquote, higher than you in the organization, or there's a couple questions ahead of time that came in through email about just having these conversations in, the polarized nature of the time we live in, right? Everything is so yes or no, black or white, right? So how do you get to this conversation?
Well, that's a multifaceted thing, Chris. And I think actually, I believe we can overthink this. That we start, surfacing these very questions you're asking, like, oh my gosh, how could I ever have this conversation? There's issues of hierarchy, there's power differentials, it's polarized right now. Those become all the reasons for why we would never go and do this. And what Peter Block would encourage us to do, I think, is to say, shift it to possibilities. What are the possibilities that we could engage people around? So I would not recommend starting with a dissent question, for example. I would probably start with some possibility questions, bringing, and the other thing from a design standpoint is being really mindful and thoughtful about who do we invite, so the invitation becomes important, and how you set the room up to engage people in having these conversations. So I guess what I would say is I would encourage everybody to just experiment. Block doesn't come out and say, here are the 7 steps to setting this up and making sure this works right. It's not that straightforward. And so that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to just take this on from an experimentation standpoint and say, all right, what's a question that I could pose, and let's see what happens. And that's what I've done. And I've never had it go sideways. Not yet, anyway. Doesn't mean that it couldn't, but I haven't had it go sideways. And I would actually like to be, my challenge for myself with this work is to actually move it out of organizations or work with a healthcare system to go out and have these conversations with their community. That's my next goal.
Looking at some of the questions that are coming in, there's a discussion going on here about, well, the start of the discussion is the question of how do you recommend we keep the dissent conversation from becoming a complaint session? And then I think there's been some really interesting commentary coming in about, you want the dissenters to be able to express themselves, but things get in the way, like hierarchy, and so people are coming up with some really good ideas here. So I don't know if you want to speak on that a little bit about how do you do that?
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these
a little bit more.
Yeah. There's a lot of good thoughts here.
There are. Yeah.
Maybe you can sandwich the dissent conversation with others. Yeah. I guess at the end of the day, I would say I don't know for sure. That's potentially a risk. But think of all the times we do not give people the opportunity to dissent. It's like, no, we don't want to go there. And I do agree that if we just do the dissent conversation without talking about any of these other pieces, that could be risky. But by the way, I would never sit down with a group and, try to plow through 5 or 6 of these questions. For me, it's like 1 or 2 at a time. Probably 3 at the most,
Got it.
and just sort of see where that takes the group, and then maybe you convene the group a second time and then explore it a little bit more and ask some different questions. But I found it to be a little bit liberating, when you've actually asked people, especially that question around, what is it that you've said yes to in the past that you no longer really mean? That's kind of interesting, and it gets people to, there's a self-awareness component to that as well. Gosh, have I done that? Am I in a different place now, and why am I in that? And back to your point earlier, Chris, about empathy, I think, if we allow for that, and it truly is a forum where we say, look, you're not here to be judged. I mean, this is back to Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, right? So if we're truly committed to creating psychological safety, then we ought to be asking questions like, hey, what is it that maybe you don't believe in as much anymore, and why, and what's going on for you? And I want to understand that more. I think we might be surprised at what comes out of that. Another, just as a quick piece around this, complaint, a quote I heard many years ago, and I can't even remember where it came from, but I like it, and it is, behind every complaint is a commitment. to something. And if you think about ourselves, when we're complaining about something, why do we complain? We complain because something we care about isn't being met in a way that we think that it ought to be.
That's really interesting. Wow, I like that. There's some people here talking also about, and it was also in your presentation, the sense being, where you build agreement from. And it makes me think, as an aside, really, of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, right? He was bringing in all of these people with differing views. He didn't want people to be, coming back to him with just what he wanted. He wanted there to be that dissent. So that's a good environment. It's a good leader.
Exactly. Great point.
So, you talked before about how language is so important. And I entirely agree and preach that all the time too. But somebody brought up a point around that time in your presentation about how the specific language of these questions is somewhat complex. And they were curious about if there was a way, or if there had been any research around making it more accessible for folks who are English language learners, or maybe at a different level of education, just so you could have these community conversations. It's okay to mess with these questions, right?
Absolutely. That's a great question and a great point. I've modified these questions.
Got it.
So I think it does depend a little bit on who are you engaging, and what's going on, and do you have potential differences around language, English as a second language, or what have you. So yeah, you have to be mindful about that.
Right.
But it doesn't mean you shouldn't ask the question. But reframe it. I mean, mess around with it. I guess the way I think about it is I just keep in mind Block's criteria for a powerful question, right? It's ambiguous,
right.
It's personal, and it evokes some level of anxiety. And so I think what we often get hung up on, and I find myself doing this, is trying to craft the perfect question. It's got to be, everybody's got to understand it. Block would say, hey, ambiguity is okay. Let people wrestle with the ambiguity. They'll figure it out. So part of it is trusting people to do that work and not feeling like we have to control or overly manage that.
I know you want to bring this into the community outside of the hospital four walls, and I know that this is going to be a loaded question for 2 minutes remaining on this webinar, but it's something to think of, I think, is how can we, imagine this, stepping back, imagine using this with patients and family, not just on patient and family advisory boards, but actually using these questions to really get at the heart of what matters for a patient, in their care, maybe around end of life, or maybe just in general, what matters, getting in there, opening those conversations with patients and their providers, they can be really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I would say co-design it with the people that need to be there in the room. Bring in the key stakeholders. Use that handout or buy the book or whatever, and then design it together. So just real quick, Chris, I know we're almost at the end of time. This community down in Oregon that I was working with, this healthcare system, they wanted to work with the community around addressing the issue of teen suicide. And they actually started using this work. And what I've learned from that, though, is people often find this concept very intriguing and enticing, and struggle a bit with actually going out and doing it, because it's easy to fall back into our comfort zone and designing these things the way we want to design them. But I got to give them a lot of credit. They started bringing various groups of people in the community together and talking about how would they structure some conversations using some of these community-based conversations around a very tough topic.
Really good. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining today, and thanks to Kurt for the great presentation. A lot of things to really think about here. I think that it's a really great time for you to have done this presentation as people start looking towards the new year and new ways of doing things. And, maybe this having some of these conversations can be part of people's New Year's resolutions here as we move on into 2020 and a new decade. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining. If you have any questions, please stay in touch. Email us or visit our website. And with that, I'm going to close the meeting, and happy holiday season to everybody.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's presentation. You may now disconnect.